My name's Elspeth Carruthers. I'm the executive director of the Neubauer Collegium, and I am thrilled and honored to welcome you all into our beautiful new building, and especially Jennifer and Candace and their fabulous project. And I wanted to explain a little bit about why we are the appropriate place in which you're to be introduced to this incredibly ambitious humanistic endeavor run by Candace and Jennifer. So that is our mandate. We are new to the University of Chicago. The Neubauer Collegium creates new communities of inquiry. We do this through three different initiatives. One which is, like Candace's and Jennifer's very ambitious project, innovative, interdisciplinary, profoundly humanistic, cutting-edge discovery research into large questions like the meaning of life and others that we feel has lacked to date a profoundly humanistic line and perspective. So that's one of the things that we're bringing in a very focused way to the University of Chicago. So we fund research projects like this that are interdisciplinary and collaborative, often international, multi-institutional. We do this through financial support, through a competitive proposal program, but also, once approved, we provide a very, very high level of support because, of course, these projects are very, very difficult to launch and sustain, and they require a very, very high level of not just financial support, but also cutting-edge, innovative administrative support to match the aims of the project. So as Candace and Jennifer can attest, there's nothing more difficult and more challenging for researchers than these kinds of collaborative interdisciplinary projects. In addition to that, we also have a global visiting fellows initiative. We invite thought leaders from all over the world to talk with project leaders, with the campus community, not just faculty, but also graduate students, postdocs, undergraduates, and generally to enliven the community of inquiry around humanistic research at the University of Chicago. That's an area that we're growing, and because we're now in the building, we can really run with the opportunity. So we're, as I said, a new organization, only 3 years old. We just came into our building in April, and so we're really just getting a sense of the incredible potential, and this is largely through partnerships with people like Candace and Jennifer. And then the last thing that I would just bring your attention to, the last initiative that we're doing is a gallery exhibit space. This is, again, very experimental, trying to explore the ways that the visual arts intersect with lines of intellectual research-based inquiry. So you'll see across the hallway our exhibit space. This is our second exhibit in that space. We're going to have 6 new exhibits this year, all highly experimental, very, very rigorous, cerebral, intersecting with the lines of inquiry that researchers are driving. And so with that, I close by saying Jonathan Lear is our faculty director. He would have loved to have been here today, but was unable because of travel. But we welcome you, and very, very particularly, we welcome Candace and Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you, Elspeth, for that wonderful, warm welcome. We are delighted to see you all here. You are our first event. And we're really pleased about it. Couldn't have imagined a better place to hold it, couldn't have imagined a better occasion than Humanities Day to begin activities connected with this grant, Virtue, Happiness, and the Meaning of Life. I've never done one of these before. So this is all very new for me. Okay. This project started out for Jennifer and I several years ago. For me, it partly started out because I got very interested in the fact that there were a whole lot of people who had very solid worlds. They had jobs that didn't grind them into the dust every day. They had something that counted as family for them. They had something that counted as a community for them, and they were basically good people. So they had done absolutely everything you're supposed to do to have a full and fulfilling human life. And there was this big hole in the middle of the life where the happiness was supposed to be. And the daily living of these very solid and sound lives was feeling like this enormous to-do list. So we started to try to think about being a good person, virtue, having a purposive and meaningful life, having things be fulfilling, and how you can do all of that without ending up with a big hole in the middle of your life. And the answer that we're exploring with this project is that the key to this is something called self-transcendence. Self-transcendence involves attachment to a kind of a good that goes beyond individual fulfillment, beyond individual expression, beyond just you and your tiny little circle. It involves seeing your life in the context of some kind of good that's bigger than your life. And the thought is that if you have that kind of a context, if you have that sort of attachment and set of connections in your world, then the business of leading a good life in an ordinary way can become happy-making and feel meaningful and purposive. That's the big thing that we're trying to investigate. And we think that self-transcendence is kind of the missing link. And between thought about virtue, which has to do with having a sound moral center, thought about happiness, deep happiness, not, yay, I got it on sale. Or huzzah, there's oatmeal cookies. But the deep kind of happiness and a feeling of meaning in one's life. That's what our project is about. It's about using work on this thing called self-transcendence to see these pieces, meaning, happiness, virtue, fitting together. Where a virtue, Jennifer will talk more about this, but a virtue is basically, an acquired virtue is a cultivated strength of character that you've got, that is part of moral development. We're of the view that that's like ongoing. It doesn't sort of stop when you're 22 or when you're 15. I have to confess that I'm still working on self-improvement over here myself, and I'm old, right? That human beings are kind of muddled. And virtue is a strength, a cultivated strength, that helps you pursue a good life harmoniously and in a way that connects you to the common good, or to broad things in nature, or to something else that's good, involves more than one human being, and is bigger than you are. Right? That's how we're understanding this. Now, it happens to be the case that we're seeing a huge cultural conversation erupting around us about happiness, meaning, virtue. According to NPR, we're about to see Oprah, former resident of Chicago, launch a 7-part documentary series that's supposed to be all about an exploration of the human need to be connected to something larger than ourselves, especially taking it through understanding of the sacred and religious stuff. But there's a lot of ways in which you can have a sense of self-transcendence. You can see your life in the context of a multi-generational family, where the struggles of the people who came before are a thing that you feel enabled the goods that you have now, and where your concern for future generations allows you to play it forward as well. So you see your life there. It could be that you've got a particular feel for nature. It could be that you've got a particular spiritual practice. But empirical research suggests that if you have an attachment to one of these kinds of self-transcendent goods, if that is part of how you understand yourself and what you do, you're going to have a better life outcome than if you don't. So there's a lot in support of this. So let's see. And our hope for this project is to actually provide some conceptual clarity, some rigor, some systematicity, and some very serious attention paid to this concept of self-transcendence, to bring it into both public conversation and specific academic conversations that are ongoing. Okay. And in order to do that, we're going to, among other things, be seeking to develop a clearer concept of self-transcendence, the kind of thing empirical social scientists call a construct, and then work with empirical social scientists to develop tools to actually assess and measure that construct. Once we understand what it is that we're trying to investigate, we can begin to explore different tools and techniques and instruments for investigating it. So we are operating, it is a big collaborative project. We have a group of 30 scholars across different fields. We are, our activities associated with the grant are going to include things like lectures, public lectures in connection with meetings twice a year, in connection with a visiting scholar, those sorts of things. Conferences, there will be a conference, for those of you who know anything about the virtue literature, on Aristotelianism, old and new, at the University of South Carolina, where Jennifer works. There will also be a capstone conference for this project here in Chicago in October of 2017. We're also bringing a visiting scholar each spring, it's a 2-year grant, each spring to Chicago to develop and teach a joint undergraduate course on this kind of material, and to lead a faculty doctoral student discussion group on this stuff to help get this conversation going in lots of different parts of the university. All right, we're sponsoring 2 summer seminars for entry-level faculty, baby PhDs, and doctoral students, hosted by the Marathon Center and Moreau Seminary in Notre Dame, where we've brought together a group of faculty from across our disciplines to work together to try to help these people learn how to think across disciplinary divisions about these kinds of major life questions. Okay? The major engine that is running this whole thing is working group meetings for these 30 scholars. These 30 scholars are all have work in progress happening in their own disciplinary fields, okay? We're going to get together for 1 week every December in South Carolina, and for where it's actually lovely in December, and for 1 week every June here in Chicago, hosted by this wonderful institution, where it's actually lovely in June, in order to have intensive discussion of work in progress in each of these different fields from each of our scholars. The abstracts for the papers that will be under discussion will be available on our website. The work in progress, that's in group. That's not yet for publication, hence in progress. Right. But that stuff will allow us to have impact in a lot of different places at one time. And it will allow us to bring all these heads to bear with those sorts of framing questions about self-transcendence on a huge range of really good projects. Okay? So, I'm going to talk a little bit initially about the empirical psychology piece of this. Empirical psychologists have begun research on something called self-transcendence. If you read across that research, what you find out is that by using the same term, they aren't all studying the same thing, right? Some of the definitions in psychology of self-transcendence are unhappily also associated with things like delusions, right? Like, I'm so beyond myself, I'm Napoleon, right? That's how far outside of me I am. But so there's a lot of work and tinkering to be done on the kinds of constructs that are being deployed in empirical psychology. But empirical psychology is a way of making sure that you're keeping your feet on the ground when you're dealing with these massive, abstract life questions. So we are counting on our data guys to help us make sure that what we're investigating actually touches the lives and comes from the lives of people. We want this to stay in touch with ordinary human beings and not just be an ivory tower moment of smug mutual satisfaction. Okay. Jennifer is going to talk about our other fields a little bit and about the way that we've designed this program.
Okay, so as Candace said, we're going to have empirical psychologists to, as it were, keep our feet on the ground. But on the other hand, we're also going to have religious scholars and theologians to, as it were, keep our eyes towards heaven in a sense, and to think about those aspects of self-transcendence that are transcendent in the highest register, right? And we're very interested, and we take very seriously the perspective of theologians and various religious traditions, because we feel that they are especially attuned to the role that self-transcendence plays in human life, and that is really across cultures. And what's interesting when you get into religious studies and theology is that it's not always a theoretical issue, right? There's a theoretical understanding of, a framework of thinking about self-transcendent good and its connections to virtue and happiness, but there's a very deep practical element, and not just an understanding of the sorts of spiritual practices which, as it were, get you there. But there's also a participation in them. And so we're interested in these spiritual practices and disciplines which are meant to make real in you this kind of self-transcendent orientation. And we think we have a lot to learn from the various religious traditions, and we're interested in looking at that. Another thing that this field is bringing to the project, which we think is very important, is the idea that there are areas of human existence and human life our capacity to understand go beyond reason or rational argument. Some classic examples maybe are things like the mystery of human pain and suffering, or the mystery of human love, right? These are things that philosophers have tried to explain, but perhaps there's a kind of limit to what a valid argument can get you in these areas. And so the idea is that these traditions have a different, interesting perspective worth taking seriously. And it's important to our project also that the religious scholars and theologians that we're drawing upon are interfaith, right? So we're not just looking at one faith tradition or even one kind of faith tradition, that is to say the Abrahamic, but we've really made an effort to bring in a kind of ecumenical interfaith perspective. And not just because that's a nice thing to do, but because it's critical for the sort of research we want to do. That is to say, make this connection as being truly human. And if it's truly human, it is going to transcend cultural boundaries. So that's why we're bringing them on board, and we're very excited about that. And the final group would be philosophers.
Like us.
Right, like us. Do you want to take philosophers, Candace, or do you?
Oh, sure. I mean, what we can do in philosophy is work pretty hard on conceptual clarification, on developing really important distinctions that help us to think more clearly, and on standards for rigorous, rational argument. That's the thing that we're supposed to be in the business of doing. And that's the thing that we have to contribute to this project. So it may very well be that we'll be working back and forth with empirical data and sometimes with spiritual insight from our religious thinkers to try to get a better conceptual framework a better argumentative structure, a better way of methodically going through the relations between thought about virtue, thought about happiness, and thought about the meaning of life. Now, the usual way that that gets done in philosophy and empirical psychology, both, is through work on, so for us, of course, investigating self-transcendence is supposed to be the missing link between these things. That's what's supposed to tie them together. That's what's it's having a self-transcendent orientation that's supposed to allow ordinary virtue to be a source of happiness and meaning. Most of this work in psychology and in philosophy is carried out through understanding of Aristotle. Aristotle, there's an Aristotelianism that is going to inform our approach, but we are actually going to use Thomas Aquinas as our principal figure helping us think about this.
Right, so which invites the question, why Aquinas? Which is a very good question. But I think a previous question typically needs to be answered first, and that is, who is Aquinas? In my experience, people might have some familiarity with Aristotle and who he was and his historical context, but might not know who Aquinas is. And one of the things that makes our project really unique is that we're moving beyond Aristotle. And frankly, one of the things that brought Candace and I together was a kind of mutual respect for and interest in the ethical thought of Thomas Aquinas. So I'm going to say something about who Aquinas is and why we care about him so much. Aquinas was a 13th century theologian, right? So he's living and working at a time we think of as the scholastic period in philosophy. He's a master of theology at the University of Paris. Aquinas was born into the noble classes of what is now southern Italy. And if you're born into that class, it's expected of you that you will take on certain roles in life. Perhaps you'll be a military leader. Perhaps you'll be a lawyer, right? Perhaps you might run a famous monastery, which in fact is what Aquinas' parents assumed he was going to do, and they sent him to Monte Cassino at like 5. Aquinas, however, decided that his vocation was to join these new, radical, upstart mendicant orders. Probably the most famous or familiar order is the Franciscans, right? These kind of barefoot, itinerant, preaching this kind of gospel of the radical poverty. But Aquinas wanted to be a Dominican. And a Dominican was even newer and more radical than the Franciscans. And the Dominicans, or the order of preachers, like all mendicant orders, they wanted to go directly to the people, right? They wanted to meet the people where they are, who they were. They didn't want it to be so mediated. And so Aquinas went, like any good Dominican, to preach and to teach. And part of that for him would be to preach and teach about how to live, right? About how it is that you're supposed to live a human life. And so he has this sort of radical vocation that his parents are very disapproving of. In fact, they actually locked him in the attic for some time in the hope that he would come to his senses. He did not. He did not come to his senses, and his parents realized they just had to let him do this. Now, what's interesting to me about his choices of vocation is that I think it leads him to a slightly different understanding of human nature, and one that is perhaps more realistic, a little more earthy, a little closer to the ground than the one that you find in Aristotle. So for Aristotle, the virtuous man, right, is this kind of wealthy, aristocratic, literally it's a man, right? It has to be a man. In fact, Aristotle says that women are incapable of genuine virtue. And Aristotle, he's really emphasizing the kind of virile strength, those aspects of human nature And he's not interested in, he either is sort of unaware or uninterested in those aspects of human life which reveal our interdependence, our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, and that would extend to our physical, but also, you know, our emotional, our mental weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And Aquinas doesn't shy away from this aspect of human life. And I think that this leads Aquinas to have a different kind of theory than Aristotle in three main respects. So the first respect is that Aquinas happily acknowledges that we are very imperfect, that we will mess up, in Aquinas' language, that we will sin, and that living a good life can be very hard, even for good people. Even for good people born into a nice family with good, solid values and who don't face incredible hardships in life, people, that is to say, who have been relatively lucky, right? It's still hard even for them. And even people that we want charitably to say are virtuous are still going to mess up. So he acknowledges that we're going to fail, and he accepts that as just part of what it is to be a human being. And I think he connects this to our vulnerability and our interdependence, and therefore he's especially attuned to our need for communal life, and our need to pay attention to human pain and suffering and to be able to make sense of it. And Aquinas also, in a way that Aristotle simply wasn't, is attuned to those spaces when maybe rational argument runs out, right? Maybe you've reached a point where, as Wittgenstein says, your spade won't turn. And finally, I think as a result of this different conception of human nature, he has a different conception of the virtues. That is to say, he has a more expansive conception of them. So there are virtues that Aquinas thinks are central to finding a happy and meaningful life that Aristotle has nothing to say about. Virtues like mercy and hope and what he will call caritas, or charity, right? These are foundational for Aquinas, and they are untheorized by Aristotle. And I think because he has this more expansive conception of virtue and human nature, Aquinas also has a much more expansive and rich conception of who can be a moral exemplar. Okay, so for Aquinas, women can be moral exemplars. There are women saints. There are mystics, right? Who are, it's not just Athenian generals. There are poor people who live happy and meaningful life. And so this aspect of Aquinas' thought is especially appealing to us. And we think that he is a little bit closer to how we're thinking human beings are, and a little more attuned to the scope of moral theory, namely that it includes all of us.
That is exactly right, and that we've got a lot to learn from one another. He's painting with a very broad canvas, and very broad, and fine details on a broad canvas is kind of my feel about reading Aquinas. And he sees the common good as crucial to individual well-being all the way through. Now, you might be asking why exactly we're doing these particular disciplines. I think we kind of covered some of that in discussion. But now we're going to move into talking about the exact group of scholars that we have assembled for this project, who are going to be busily reading the work of everybody else's name you see up here and getting together to talk about it. It's actually an extraordinary range of people. It's an international group of people. Those are our philosophers. And here are the kinds of questions that our philosophers are bringing to this group for consideration as part of a way to come at an understanding of self-transcendence. I'll give you a moment to look at them.
They're too little to see.
Oh dear. Well, in that case, should intention factor into the way we look at those who cooperate in evil? That's Kevin Flannery's question. How do ordinary people become virtuous, and how does virtue shape them? Nancy Snow's question. What can poetry teach us about spirituality? David Carr. What are the norms inherent in the ethical study of human behavior? John Haldane. How does happiness operate as the constitutive aim of human life? Jennifer Frey. How do the ways that we learn not to wrong someone influence our understanding of ourselves, each other, and the social context we share? Matthias Haase. How does awe, A-W-E, awe, help us understand the human capacity for moral change? Christian Christiansen. Those are the sets of questions. Then we've got our religious thinkers and theologians.
Right, so what's interesting about this list, and I think important about it, is again that it's ecumenical, it's interfaith. So not only do we have representatives from the three Abrahamic faiths, but we also have some non-Abrahamic faiths represented. And as you can see here, the questions start to change a little bit in interesting ways. So Mary Stewart, who's at my university, South Carolina, what is the relationship between the human moral condition and the conditions of the environment? So she's doing interesting work in global warming and how Hindu communities are dealing with that. How are our ideas about what it means for Christ to become human shaped and influenced by the divine personhood of Christ? This is a theologian at Catholic University of America. How does Aquinas understand the relationship between the moral emotions and justice? It's Jean Porter at Notre Dame. What is the relationship between Aquinas' idea of human flourishing and its integral component of happiness and academic enterprise? So what does this have to do with living a good, happy life? Should one cultivate the virtue of humility, or it is a weak virtue, encouraging dependence and obedience? David Schatz. So that's especially interesting, given that I'm pretty sure Aristotle would have thought it was a little weak and unnecessary. There's no talk of humility in Aristotle. Am I missing one? Oh, how do prophecy and martyrdom focus the person on that which is greater than the self? And that's a question posed by Joseph Stern here at UChicago. How does classical Arabic oratory influence contemporary preachers and politicians?
Empirical, also here.
Right, also here at the University of Chicago. Does the human search for truth also make someone open to religious questions? Father Thomas Joseph White, the Dominican House of Studies.
These are our principal empirical psychologists. Dan McAdams is a social psychologist and chair of department at Northwestern University. Paul Wong is the meaning man, who's emeritus at Trent University. Howard Nussbaum and Mark Berman are both cognitive neuroscientists here at the University of Chicago, and Catherine Kinsler is a developmental psychologist. And they're asking, let's see, are we fixed adults with little capacity to change, or are we beings who can use experience to increase wisdom and human flourishing? That's Howard Nussbaum. Why are some generative narratives involving commitment to future generations culturally favored over others? Dan McAdams. How do people understand virtue, happiness, and meaning of life when they are stretched thin by work and family obligations? Mark Berman.
That question is real.
Can we measure happiness and meaning empirically, like at all? Paul Wong. What influence does a child's early ideas of virtue have on the understanding of purposeful and socially just acts across her lifetime? That's Catherine Kinsler. So you can see that even though this is a group of very distinguished academics, the way they're approaching this whole project is in terms of questions that touch on central aspects of ordinary human life. And that's a huge piece of the ambition of this project for us. And our project will, now we get to start thanking people. A project that is made possible through the generosity of the John Templeton Foundation. Yeah, you should take a pic. They'll want to see. But also the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, the Humanities Division at the University of Chicago, the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society, the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues in the UK. They do educational policy initiatives for the whole of the UK. They really want to be involved with this project. The Jacques Maritain Center at Notre Dame, the Thomistic Institute at the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., and then, of course, Lumen Christi Institute here in Chicago. All of these groups are contributing to us in very important ways, and we are grateful to all of them for the opportunity to do this work. That's what we have for you.
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
We must tell you about our website.
Oh.
So you can follow, so this is a 2-year, actually it's a 28-month project. So it's ongoing, and this is literally the beginning event. This is our website, virtue.uchicago.edu. You can bookmark it and check in with us because we will be continually updating this site. But one of the things you can do now is you can click on our team and learn something about Candace and myself, but also our scholars. So we have profiles of all of our scholars as well as abstracts posted, the abstracts of the works that they're going to present at our working group meetings. And we also have a news archive, which should be of some interest. But I think most especially we have this thing, the Virtue blog, which I'm very excited about. So we have a blog, and the blog is going to be updated at least 3 times a week. And our first substantive post will be next week. One of our scholars, who's a joint PhD in economics and philosophy, is going to be writing a series of posts on whether or not money can make us happy. And though he's an economist, his answer is no. So you can check in to see what he has to say. But we'll have a lot of really exciting posts that'll be, like blog material, short and sweet, and really geared towards a generally educated audience, not written for specialists. So I hope that you will check back in on our website often. Okay, that's it. So now
we also hope that you'll fill out these little surveys because it really will help us to adjust our activities to find out how they work. And we hope that we can have questions and coffee and tea and cookies and stuff now. Go ahead.
Great. So we're happy to take questions.
Yes.
Let me assume that you decide that, transcendence of the self really does help people have understanding and a further study as to how to acquire it. Because I think just thinking I'd like to transcend myself does not work, as I've discovered since I've been retired.
Yeah.
I have no idea what to do with myself.
I understand. There's 2 sorts of places where, the question is, suppose I'm convinced by you, and I do think, I want self-transcendence as my orientation. How on earth do I do that? Right? I mean, what am I supposed to do next? And there's going to be various ways that we think about that. Some of those ways are going to be connected to education at various levels through the Jubilee Center initiatives. But some of them are connected to things like spiritual practices, community involvement of various kinds, focus on nature, on the common good, on those kinds of goods that are transpersonal. But mostly, you've got to actually get involved with various things, I think, in order to get the benefit of this. Even if it's the most upward-facing kind of high, mysterious religious transcendence, you're going to get there through spiritual practices that have been put in place by other human beings and that other human beings have to share with one another. Does that help?
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm wondering what your fundamental text for Aquinas is. I'm assuming like the Nicomachean Ethics for Aristotle, but what's the parallel in Aquinas, or what books are assumed on it?
Right, that's an excellent question. So the question is, what is the, as it were, paradigmatic? Aquinas wrote a mass. I will not pretend that I've read all of it.
Yeah.
Right, he wrote reams, and so what are we going to focus on? I think we haven't really stipulated in advance one key text, but I would imagine that people will be drawing heavily from the Summa Theologiae, right? And in particular, the focus would be the treatise on action, the treatise on the passions, the treatise on the virtues, the kind of core of his ethical theory, and even to a certain extent the treatise on law, insofar as that's where he gets into the first principles of practical reason. But there are other texts that would be good examples. For instance, Aquinas has, in addition to a theory of virtue, a theory of vice, which he articulates in the De Malo, or the disputed question on evil. And so he appreciates not only that the virtues will make you happy, but he's very specific about how the vices will destroy your life. So he speaks of avarice and its 7 daughters, right? And then the way that greed is going to lead to all sorts of other bad acts, and it's just going to, right, emanate throughout your entire life. So that's another really rich source. Candace, were you thinking of something?
No, I was, the ST and the De Malo have been really important, but the Summa contra Gentiles.
Right, the other Summa.
The other Summa, well, there's a couple of the compendia. That one is, I think, actually a really nice starting place for people who are not quite ready to dive into the ST, because it's much more condensed, I think,
Right.
and a
Right.
little easier to follow.
There's also the disputed questions on virtue,
Yeah.
which is smaller, more manageable.
That's a separate text.
Yes.
Disputed questions on virtue.
Right, exactly. Because Aquinas, as I mentioned, was teaching at the University of Paris. And so these scholastic texts reflect the way that the university was structured, right? So the way that the Summa is structured, right, reflects how you actually taught, right? There's a question. You start with objections, right? You give a response or a respondio, and then you reply to all the objections. And the objections aren't just any objections. They're the objections from Augustine, from Cicero. You have to know your history. It's a very interesting way, a very great way, I think, of doing philosophy. It's incredibly systematic. Yeah.
Yes.
What? You've assembled an eminent scholarly group interdisciplinary. At the end of it all, what are your expectations? I have a suspicion that one of the expectations is that the pursuit of these questions is actually the result, that this group will feel happier, virtuous. That's important. I don't see
Yeah.
that in a
No.
negative way, because
Yeah.
that's a very important motivation for coming together to do this. But operationally, when you're all done, and presumably you have discovered something that in a long and exciting and illustrious, and more words that fail me, history of philosophy and exploration, that you presumably hope you will arrive something that has not been quite arrived in the same way before, and that has some application societally.
Now,
So my question is, again, what are the expectations at the end of this? I'm certain, I believe I'm certain, that the process will be wonderful for the investigators.
yes.
For some more than others. But at the end, what do you expect?
The question is, I'm going to have to condense you a lot. So he actually gave a very interesting discussion of the result of all of this work. He said at the end, what sort of we have to repeat it because people on the streaming can't hear what's going on in the room, but they can hear what's going on from these microphones. At the end, what sort of what expectation of kinds of results do you want to have? Presumably, you think you will have come upon something in a different way, and presumably the scholars involved are going to have had a great time, which is true, and will have had developed all kinds of things. It is a network project, so one of the things that we hope to do is to seed future research involving partnerships between members of this group across disciplinary boundaries. The need to seed future generations of research on these questions is what is informing our bringing a visiting scholar to teach classes and lead faculty doctoral student discussion groups here, and also what's fueling the summer seminars, because that's going to be places where we're busy trying to teach younger generations of academics how to approach these questions coming around through research modalities that are otherwise alien to them. It's actually, doing cross-disciplinary work is actually very difficult. At the moment, one of the things our scholars are doing is reading tiny little pages, like tiny little papers that each of them has written to explain her or his field or subfield to the rest of the scholars, and the kind of intervention in that field or subfield that the individual is trying to do. We're reading all about each other's work to try to make it likely that we will be able to have a more productive initial working group meeting in December. But one of it's a network project. It's meant to seed future research coming out of that network. It's meant to seed future generations of scholars who are interested in approaching these things in ways that are not narrowly disciplinary or subdisciplinary. And it's meant to have an impact through all those works in progress that are getting reinflected, reshaped, criticized, sent out, and published from all those illustrious people, thanks in part to the constructive criticism and support that they've had in this intensive conversation. Does that help get at it?
Yes and no. First, it helps me understand my error. I made an assumption that there would be an end, and what your description is it's endless. And it's endless, I think, because it'll be infectious, the happiness and virtue and the meaning from one generation of scholars to another. But it doesn't answer my question, and there must be an answer from this, I would think. I cannot think this is just a scholarly,
No, it's not.
self-focused exercise for multi-generations. How will it benefit my great-grandson?
Well,
To be born?
what we want is to actually enter into this ongoing, increasing cultural conversation about these topics, about virtue, happiness, and meaning, that's been kind of building for about the past 10 years in all kinds of ways, in the Atlantic, in other, in these documentaries, in movies, in books, in op-ed pieces, in David Brooks' little stuff, all those places. We want this project to feed into the general public conversation about these matters, and we have a number of strategies for doing that, not the least of which is having prominent public intellectuals on our rolls.
Right, so maybe one thing that's helpful to say is that ideas matter, right? Because ideas eventually work their way down into practice. And virtue, believe it or not, was a relatively neglected thing in philosophy for a very long time. It became a very secondary derivative concept. And then that started to get reflected in practice. I always ask my students, first thing, name a virtue. They can't. It's astonishing they can't name a single one. And I'll be like, hey, what about justice? And they're like, oh, yeah. I mean, they are literally, and so to connect it to your great-grandchildren, your grandchildren, if we make a big deal of virtue, right, then education changes, right? And we start talking about virtue again. Right? We don't just talk about don'ts, but we talk about, you know, why you do what you do. We talk about honesty. We talk about courage. We talk about justice. Nobody talked about that when I was growing up in school. And so it's a kind of resurrection of a certain way of thinking. And thinking isn't just abstract. It makes its way down into how we live.
I mean, Jubilee Center does educational initiatives for the entire UK. I mean, it may not help your kids and grandkids, but it's
Thank you.
filtering in.
You want to ultimately modify some of the cultural conversation.
Yes.
Which is what people talk about, what people look at the screen for.
Exactly.
But perhaps if they still talk, most of the conversations don't.
It's not just theory. Mm-hmm.
You know, it's interesting that you've got a series of experts, each of which are functioning in silos. I'm assuming at some point in your process, you're going to bring in the people that are good at working across silos.
Most of these people
Because all
were.
of this, I mean, the entire process is geared to staying in your own discipline. So a good example is The Economy of Grace, a book written here at the University of Chicago, where somebody from the religious side tried to figure out something from the business side, and it produced a product.
Yes. Well, actually, these are not just randomly chosen famous scholars. Every one of the scholars on this list has some actual on-the-ground experience with talking across the boundaries of a silo. I mean, all of our religious thinkers have had some substantive engagement with interfaith questions. Our philosophers, we are actually the hardest bunch because philosophers are really like, what we do is reason. We don't know what the rest of you are up to. So we're often terrible, but we've got a group of philosophers together who actually can talk like human beings to their fellow human beings. And our religious studies people, as I say, are all interfaith. Our empirical people are really wanting to be part of this because they're wanting the benefit of a broader kind of discussion of the concepts and constructs with which they're working, because they think that'll help them design better instruments. So I think, yes, everybody's got a job in a discipline, but it's a group of people that were selected partly because we can have some confidence that they can talk to one another. Does that help?
I'm just curious. You know, I grew up Catholic, so I have a certain regard for Aquinas. But beyond Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Asians, atheists, what's the regard for Aquinas? And is it off-putting to some groups that you've chosen to have as your basis for analysis? I know he's well known as a philosopher, but a Catholic, essentially. How does that jive?
So the question is, what is the regard for Aquinas? And I take it that the scope of the question is beyond our regard for him, but just within the academy at large.
Or the world at large.
Right.
All the many, many people that are involved in the project.
There's a sense in which Aquinas is the victim of his own success, historically. So that is to say, Aquinas became sort of bound up in Catholic doctrine post-Trent, right, post-Reformation. And so he became really tied to Catholic belief and doctrine. And so he was only thought of in that way. I think that now, at least within certain philosophical circles, there is starting to be the recognition that he's a very serious moral thinker in his own right. And that, I mean, one of the things that gets lost about Aquinas is that he believed in pagan virtue, right? So he believed that it was possible to live a good, happy life without Christian revelation, right? And this made him quite different from St. Augustine, for instance. And it also made him like a radical in his day. I think people don't realize that Aquinas was a radical in more ways than one, and Aquinas was condemned. There was the condemnation of 1277. Aquinas got in trouble, right? And so he wasn't always the institutional face of the Catholic Church. And so I think we're trying to make Aquinas less of an obviously, just speaking to Catholics, something that should only be of concern to Catholics, because that's the one group that's going to have heard of him. You talk to some Catholics and they're like, yeah, Aquinas. But if you go into a philosophy conference and you start talking about Aquinas, people might be like, why aren't you just talking about Aristotle? I mean, this is a question I get all the time. Why aren't we just talking about Aristotle? I know Aristotle. Why do I have to read? Look at how much he wrote. I'm a finite being. Why isn't Aristotle enough? And so that's why there is this legitimate question, why Aquinas? And I think it was central to us to make a case, that he really is closer to us in very interesting ways that are often ignored. I mean, people forget that. Aristotle believed in natural slaves, and he thought women couldn't think. I mean, these are not beliefs that Aquinas had. He is in interesting ways closer to the ground of how we think about human beings. But he's also an Aristotelian. He's pushing Aristotelianism in new and interesting directions. And so that's what our focus is. I think his regard isn't quite what we would like it to be, and we're hoping that our research pushes it forward, gets people to notice Aquinas.
At this point, we
can do one more question.
Okay, we can do one more question. Okay.
When you talk about happiness, it makes me think of Flow and Csikszentmihalyi and people like that. But is your scope exclusively religious and spiritual, as opposed to his idea, which is more by working hard, getting into a flow experience, you can have happiness?
The question was, when I think of happiness, I think about all the work on flow. And is your understanding of happiness exclusively sort of religious or spiritual, or does it actually contain that kind of stuff about flow? The flow stuff connects to Aquinas most directly in discussion of pleasure, basically. Pleasure is an aspect of happiness, right? I think it is an aspect of happiness. If nothing is enjoyable, if you can't get lost in the activity of any aspect of your life in such a way that you can feel yourself part of it and it part of you, chances are things are not going real well, right? But what we're after is an overall understanding of things going well. That kind of thing is certainly an aspect of it, but I don't think it's the whole of it. In answer to the religious question, no. A number of those scholars are atheists. A number of those scholars, it's really important to them to not be doing something that's in any way directed to deity, the sacred, something like that. But they recognize that dimension of human experience as a thing that you need to take seriously. I mean, if you're interested in most humans, you're interested in really a lot of people who think there's something there. So they take it seriously, we take it seriously, but we're really not thinking it's all going to turn out to be beatific union in the end, even if that might be what it looks like for some of them. Okay, thank you all.